Hello, 2-2 group. This is Colonel Gallagher, courtesy of his house, and hope everything's okay this Easter weekend for you guys. I'm going to tell you a little bit about civil rights. I'm not going to try to do too long. It would take too long to do it. I sent you my notes on civil rights. Please make sure you look at those notes. That's where all of the details are at. When we talk about civil rights, where I want to start is in March of 1965. And it's an odd place seemingly, but it's not to start. I'm talking about a speech that President Lyndon Johnson gave before Congress. And the point of his speech was he wanted full support by Congress for something called the Civil Rights Act or the Civil Rights Bill. And this was about to be a voting rights act. And if you think about it, civil rights really is this concept, the civil rights movement. If you had me first semester, we looked at an article by John Hope Franklin, and in that article, Franklin discussed the idea of the African Americans prior to the Civil War in the 1830s, 1840s, 1850s, looking for their civil rights. Frederick Douglass was one of the gentlemen that Dr. Franklin wrote about, as well as several others. And it brings a point back to that analysis you guys did in the first semester by Mr. Franklin. It was the idea, and he pointed out, that African Americans weren't sitting on the sidelines waiting for somebody to do something for them. Instead, they were moving themselves. They were fighting for their rights in a nonviolent way, as Frederick Douglass also did, through reason. And civil rights, then, in its heart, is based on the American nation. The very essence of the beginning of the American nation, the American idea, is none less than government based on the consent of the governed. The idea of equal rights. If we want to go to the Declaration of Independence, all men are created equal is used quite often for a reason. You should know what this means by now. In a state of nature, we're all born with the same natural rights. But also in there, okay, inherent in the American idea, is that the American government has this tremendous hope that is based on. And that's why I started with that speech in 1965, because in that speech, Johnson made it very clear. Even if the American nation gained the greatest amount of wealth, even if the American nation defeated every enemy possible, if the American nation did all these things but failed to desegregate, failed to allow the same equal rights, then the people and the nation had failed. That was what the American experiment was about. That's the noble experiment. And certainly when he gave that speech in March of 1965, it was over almost 100 years exact from the end of the American Civil War, which was about, yes, in Lincoln's own words in his second inaugural, and also the wonderful Gettysburg Address of 1863. Okay? And so when you think about civil rights, it's this arc through history. It's not this one time. Just like an arc of lightning has power and strength, the civil rights movement had this power to proclaim that this is what was the birthright of all men, regardless of race, regardless of creed, including women. Because in 1969, you can look her up, her name Shirley Chisholm. It was a New York House of Representative member, stood up before Congress and gave a speech about the Equal Rights Amendment. And so the civil rights movement is about proclaiming the natural rights, the equal rights of all, which is the American birthright in this sense. So when you look at the American civil rights movement, we can go to 1954 with Brown v. Board, which ironically starts with a school. Little girl wants to go to a school, Linda Brown, regardless of skin color. That is equal opportunity. Education is the foundation for the American government, the American system. How can you have a democracy with an uneducated group of people, whether it be leaders that come out of that democracy or chosen by that democracy, isn't it now? Okay, to 1955, the Rosa Parks, okay, and your Montgomery bus boycott, which brought in Martin Luther King Jr. And Martin Luther King Jr. certainly wasn't the man who made the Montgomery bus boycott happen. It preceded him. And it gives an interesting point. What was Martin Luther King's role? King was important, significant, obviously, or else people wouldn't talk about it so much, right? But what was King's real role? King was really a bridge. He was the gentleman who could articulate and pronounce the idea, this bridge between the white population and the African American population. It was extremely important. King was a great communicator and passionate. And therefore, you have to have this various groups within the civil rights movement. Not everybody lined up behind King. We could talk about Malcolm X, who didn't. You had some others as well we could name who didn't agree with King's tactics and methods. I mean, even Malcolm X pointed out that this is not what a revolution's about. A revolution's about violence. A revolution is in your face, violence in the sense that it's militant. Um, I mean, I love when Malcolm X said to simply go to the same movie theater, to simply sit in the same bus station. And I love the line where he said, "Just so we can sit on, so we can sit on a toilet next to a white person." He says that's not a revolution. So when you look at this, there's all these different groups within the civil rights movement. So it's not just King, okay? It's a mass movement. It's people in their location standing up, taking tremendous risk. Birmingham, Alabama, 1963 is one of the most violent you could ever see on TV, where police dogs are ripping into the flesh. Little black children are being beaten by police officers, for goodness sakes, because they're marching. You have the sit-ins in 1961 in Greensboro, North Carolina. One of the best things ever happened to me in the summer is when I got to go to the African American Museum, the History Center in D.C., and I got to see all of these wonderful collection of authentic material from the period of time. You could step right back into it. It's really not just, as Johnson said in his speech, it is not denying a group, it is denying the American dream. It is denying the American way. Think about World War II. What were they fighting for and what were they fighting against? And that's why when you think of the invasions of Normandy and you think of the sacrifice, there must be a purpose and a point. But finally, with Lyndon Johnson, the weight of the federal government came behind it. Okay, and that was important. Okay, so this is something that King did, is that bridge, 1963, not only in Birmingham, Alabama, but I'm sure you're thinking of I Have a Dream speech. And the most important part in that I Have a Dream speech is not just I have a dream, but at the very beginning, he says, we've come to cash this promissory note that all men are created equal. It's a powerful message. It harkens back to this is what the American idea is about. And how could you, if you're living in Mississippi, the state of Mississippi, and you're black, you couldn't vote, yet in the 15th Amendment to the Constitution that had preceded it since 1870, in 1950, 1960, an African American couldn't vote. It took 1964 Freedom Summer to have students your age, a little bit older, risk their lives to go down to Mississippi to register blacks to vote, to register someone to vote. This is insane. This can't be right. And that's what the civil rights movement's about. And unfortunately, it's fading away. This is why you got to stay with it. It seems as you move in history, things just kind of fade away. Don't lose that. This is why, if you go back to that and you tie it back to that lesson I gave you by Baumgarten, right? Who was on the D-Day beaches, and he said, you've got to know this history. You've got to tell this history. Why wouldn't it be just as important to tell the civil rights movement and to know it and to learn it and to understand it and comprehend? There's nothing quite as liberating as knowledge and as reason. Okay, so thank you very much. That's just my brevity on the civil rights movement. My basis is it's got to be right. What's right about civil rights? It's got to be right, meaning those foundations. It must be true. Otherwise, what good is America? And so it really challenges to the core the idea and the identity of the American nation. Okay, we'll look more on Tuesday in some detail. We'll talk quite a bit about sit-ins, school desegregation, and I'll have a couple fun stories for you here and there, because some of them are pretty good stories. I'll tell you about the Chile incident. That's a good one. And a couple other things that went on in the civil rights movement. And look at my notes. Okay, I miss you guys. I'll see you on Tuesday. We're almost ready to wrap up the big semester. I want you to go away with a heart and a head full. Okay, thank you. Bye bye.